The base woke before dawn to a sullen sky that pressed low over aluminum roofs and made radar hum with static. Winds whipped dry sand against concrete like invisible wires. Yet operations never slowed because this outpost existed precisely where. Slowing down meant surrendering the corridor of air the Allies needed to keep the front alive. Lieutenant Naomi Rhodes moved through that pre-dawn gloom with the practiced quiet of someone accustomed to slipping between roles, neither clearly enlisted nor command. A liminal ghost whose orders always read, support personnel, technical, though her eyes held the caffeinated vigilance of a pilot permanently grounded by politics, not skill. She had arrived 6 weeks earlier on a supply flight. Her transfer paperwork, stamped with a medical evaluation that in 2 clipped sentences branded her emotionally unstable under prolonged cockpit stress, a judgment penned after one classified incident she was forbidden even to mention in her own defense. The rumor spread faster than gunfire in close quarters because pilots respect skill but fear the unpredictable. So Naomi found herself banished to diagnostics, calibrating avionics for men who saluted her politely but never let her forget she was a cautionary tail wings clipped, talent shelved. That morning, Colonel Marcus Kane strode across the tarmac, a silhouette carved against searchlights still glaring from the night shift. Kane, call sign Ironclad, was legend incarnate. 3 combat tours, 2 carrier landings in zero visibility squalls, and 1 near mythical inverted canyon exit that still played on projector screens during orientation. He carried reputation. Like armor, and the enlisted mirrored his pace because a second behind him felt like failure. When Kane barked orders, they ricocheted off hangar ribs, and that crack of authority framed Naomi's existence. She was to service his squadron of twin-engine strike fighters, run end-to-end diagnostics, update threat library firmware, and then vanish before pre-flight briefing. He never addressed her by name. He simply pointed at the aircraft and said, "Make it sing." Naomi's hands obeyed, yet her mind kept flying sorties. Alone in the avionics bay, she memorized fault patterns, visualized failure chains, and mapped them onto terrain like painter's strokes, building silent contingencies nobody asked to see. Each night she walked the deserted flight line, tasting jet fuel vapor in the still heat, whispering to turbines as if they were sleeping dragons yearning for sky. The maintenance crew joked that she was romancing the planes. They didn't grasp her private religion that an aircraft responded to respect the way a cello responded to a steady bow. A weather front, thicker than any in weeks, began crawling off the distant sea, its leading edge a bruise of cobalt veined by lightning threading sideways across the clouds. Meteorology flagged it as level amber for gusts exceeding safe launch. Thresholds within hours, but missions surged on because ground intel warned of enemy armor mobilizing beyond the range of artillery. Strike sorties had to lift before the corridor closed. Colonel Kane scheduled a dawn launch rendezvous. His 4-ship Element would depart, refuel at altitude, snap low through mountain passes, and neutralize a convoy before ice could form on wingtips. It was audacious, borderline reckless, exactly the brand of aggression that had earned him medals and the loyalty of men bred to chase fire. As the sky brightened in sickly bands, Naomi crouched beneath the flagship Ironclad 1, checking hydraulic lines. She traced feed pipes with fingertips tuned to micro-vibrations. She felt an almost undetectable shimmer, a harmonic tremor that signaled a pressure regulator on the brink of failure. The storm was coming, and something whispered to her that this morning would change everything. Naomi flagged the hydraulic issue in her tablet, red-coded urgent. Chain of command dictated she summon a senior tech, but time was razor-thin and hierarchy slower than damage. So she recalibrated the regulator herself, internalizing the risk if Kane's engine stalled on climb-out. Blame would tunnel straight to the unstable lieutenant who bypassed protocol. She logged the patch in plain view. No deception, just action. Moments later, the crew chief signed off, and Naomi's job, at least on paper, was done. But the sense of impending catastrophe persisted, a prickling along her shoulder blades she had learned never to ignore. She stood by the open cockpit ladder. As the flight crew assembled, Colonel Kane arrived last, helmet under arm, stride taut with adrenaline. Laughter bubbled through the ground staff when they noticed Naomi lingering near the seat. A few elbowed each other, trading smirks. "She thinks she's a pilot again," someone whispered, loud enough for her to hear. Kane climbed halfway up the ladder, paused beside her, and in a tone chill as dawn fog said, "Lieutenant, clear the line." She stepped back, but her eyes flicked toward the brewing storm wall, its underbelly pulsing with silent lightning. She drew breath to speak, yet swallowed it. No rank granted her voice here. The colonel settled into his seat. Harness clicked. Avionics bay flickered to life. And something about the startup whine snagged Naomi's ear, a fractional lag she'd only ever encountered in high-load simulations. She opened her mouth. The colonel's canopy slammed shut, sealing command behind polycarbonate. Naomi exhaled into the wind. There was nothing left to do but pray her calibration held. Ground crew peeled away, giving ironclad squadron room to taxi. Engines howled. Jet blast rippled heat across the tarmac. The storm front sprinted closer, wind now shrieking through antenna arrays. One by one, fighters rolled toward the runway threshold, staging for staggered takeoff. Naomi jogged alongside a maintenance cart toward the observation bunker, feeling the assault of sand and static. Overhead, warning klaxons began to wail in a pitch reserved for radar anomalies. Inside the control tower, voices overlapped, raw urgency punching through clipped radio etiquette. An AWACS bird had pinged inbound enemy drones, riding the storm front like raiders cloaked in weather. If they penetrated this airspace, they could drop cluster munitions on fuel depots while fighters were still geared down. The tower ordered an immediate scramble of reserve interceptors, but every reserve crew was already strapped into the strike package about to lift. Colonel Kane's first element reached the runway numbers. The duty controller issued "clear for takeoff." Naomi's gut seized. Launching into a headwind gusting beyond test limits was bad. Launching into a headwind seeded with enemy drones was lethal. Tower chatter spiked. Radar signatures were multiplying, altitudes plunging. Someone screamed to abort. Someone else overrode. Confusion cascaded. At that precise heartbeat, Ironclad 1's forward avionics bus flickered and rebooted. Glitch visible only inside the cockpit. Naomi saw nothing, but she felt it as if the jet were an extension of her nervous system. Colonel Kane throttled up. Afterburners licked blue. Just as the aircraft lunged forward, the leading-edge slats failed to extend fully, an artifact of the earlier hydraulic tremor. Lift coefficient dropped. The jet sagged onto its strut, nose pitching dangerously. Kane chopped power, but momentum had built. The plane yawed, wheels skidding. Naomi reacted on instinct, sprinting through jet wash. That threatened to skin her alive. She reached the side ladder before anyone noticed. Kane's canopy was still sealed, but his visor's surprise was visible. The lieutenant clawing onto his aircraft like a storm-born banshee. The mockery died in every throat around her. This wasn't a joke anymore. Naomi keyed the external intercom. "Regulator desensed. You'll lose hydraulic pressure on rotation. Abort and recycle, or she stall at 70 feet. Her voice crackled, swallowed by turbine roar, but Kane's eyes registered comprehension spiked with fury. A grounded officer challenging him in full view. He hesitated, and that hesitation slowed the entire launch chain. Other jets braked. Tower controllers barked queries. The first enemy drone popped onto primary radar, 5 miles out, hugging nap of the earth altitudes. Seconds bled away. Naomi climbed higher, flung herself into the cockpit, and before the colonel could release harness locks to throw her out, she reached across the console and executed a hot bus reset, cycling the aileron servo, resensing hydraulics faster than standard procedure allowed. The panel light steadied, slats deployed flush. Kane's fury flashed, then a colossal, concussive thud ripped across the field. An enemy drone detonating its warhead against an outer perimeter fuel truck, sending fireballs skyward. Debris rained like burning hail. Sirens erupted. The colonel's radio crackled with new priorities. Base under attack. Runway compromised. All sorties aborted. Yet the squadron was now bottleneck jets, nose to tail on a strip that might become Shrapnel Alley. Only one aircraft remained positioned to move. Ironclad 1, with its nose angled toward an alternate taxi path leading back to hardened shelter. Kane stared at Naomi, a lifetime of command instinct colliding with the stark fact that she alone had prevented his takeoff roll from ending in cartwheeling disaster. Around them, ground crew scattered. A second detonation blossomed near the southern fuel depot, and automated batteries tracked more hostile contacts inbound through the storm. "Get out of my seat," he growled through the intercom. But Naomi, still half inside the cockpit, looked over the gleaming dash and saw not a launch path, but a choke point to shepherd the other jets clear, to pivot the colonel's fighter into a rolling shield that would draw enemy drone fire away from personnel. It was an audacious tactical maneuver, one she had simulated privately after nights of studying drone attack patterns. Across the tarmac, laughter had died, replaced by screams and booming warnings. Naomi's breath quickened, but her voice was steady. "Sir, give me 30 seconds, and I'll buy this base 5 minutes." Kane's jaw worked. Another explosion punched the distant fuel farm. Wind hurled brackish smoke across the windshield. Visibility dropped. Towers begged for evacuation instructions. Kane's left hand hovered over the canopy release. Then something shifted in his gaze, calculation overriding ego. He released his straps, slid sideways into the WSO seat behind her, and snarled, "You have the stick, Lieutenant. Don't make me regret trusting unstable people." Nobody saw her smile. She settled fully into the colonel's throne, adjusted pedals, throttled to nominal idle, and whispered to the machine. Her machine answered with a shudder that sounded like anticipation. Ground crew stared, mouths open, as the dishonored lieutenant. They'd mocked hours earlier, now taxied the squadron commander's bird into the path of incoming fire. For a fleeting instant, through smoke and sirens, Naomi felt the sky open wide inside her chest, not the literal sky, but the infinite expanse that only a cockpit grants, where gravity and judgment fall mute before the raw conversation between pilot and machine. The storm was still coming. Drones were still diving. But the next move belonged to the woman nobody trusted, who now sat in the colonel's seat, engines roaring, destiny aligning like tungsten rails, ready to launch her not merely into air, but into legend. The taxi roll began like a pulse through living steel, the twin engines trembling beneath Naomi's boots as if the machine itself sensed that something forbidden was finally happening. Every hand on the flight line froze, because no one could quite believe that the disgraced lieutenant they'd mocked only hours earlier now occupied the colonel's seat, with the colonel silently wedged behind her, strapped into the WSO station, like a passenger on his own flagship. Sirens wailed across the base. Smoke from the first drone strike clawed at the torn sky, and the great storm front loomed overhead in a boiling wall of graphite. Yet Naomi guided Ironclad 1 down the maintenance taxiway with a precision so smooth it felt ceremonial. The fighter's nosewheel kissing painted center lines as though the paint itself had memory of her fingertips from countless midnight walks. When she traced every crack in the concrete to memorize escape routes no briefing had ever covered. She did not glance back at Kane, though she felt his stare drilling into the back of her helmet, felt his disbelief mutating into grudging appraisal as he scrolled through system pages on the left, MFD, and discovered that every hydraulic and avionics value sat perfectly balanced with intolerance, an impossible equilibrium given the chaos erupting around them. Until he remembered how many times he had ordered her to make it sing, and how many nights she had stayed alone with these jets long after the authorized crew clocked out, communing with sensors no one else bothered to speak to. Now the jet obeyed her touch like a bloodhound obeys a single whistle, and the men who once wore their skepticism like rank insignia found themselves eating exhaust as she accelerated past fuel trucks toward the eastern perimeter, where the maintenance spur split off from the main runway, an area theoretically too narrow for fighters, but which Naomi had measured to the millimeter weeks ago because she'd known one day dogma and reality would collide, and someone would need space to improvise. Radar chatter in the tower morphed from clip codes to outright panic as enemy drones surfed the storm's leading edge, skimming in at treetop height to avoid surface-to-air batteries. Their signatures flickered and jumped as rain static laced the scopes, but Naomi's mental map remained sharp, each blip matching a contingency she'd rehearsed during sleepless graveyard shifts while others joked about her instability. She toggled the external lights to combat mode steady red on the right, flashing white tail, an old trick to spoof optical homing algorithms into thinking the aircraft was in post-takeoff climb. Then she pumped a burst of throttle that set the exhaust plumes writhing like dragonfire beneath the low cloud ceiling. The blast washed over a row of sandbagged pallets where two ground crewmen crouched with nothing but handheld radios in the unlucky honor of being closest to the fuel farm. One of them raised a fist half salute, half plea as she swept past. And in that instant, Naomi absorbed the weight of every life now depending on her unapproved maneuver. Every mechanic, cook, intel clerk, and pilot still trapped in steel cockpits, waiting for a tow that would never arrive because the tow tractor sat ablaze under a plume of detonated JP-8. Inside the cockpit, the threat receiver lit up with a pair of incoming micro-missile LOX drones vectoring off the main attack lane. Precisely as she wanted, she armed the lure pods bolted to the weapon's hardpoints, devices she had personally calibrated for thermal mismatch during last week's training stand-down when others played cards. With a flick, she dropped two decoys onto the taxiway. They ignited in roaring magnesium flare as she banked left, and the drones pounced on the false heat like feral dogs, freeing her to push deeper along the spur until she reached the junction that curved around the base's eastern blast wall. Wind slammed the vertical stabilizers. Cross gusts punched at control surfaces. Yet Naomi feathered the rudder pedals with surgical increments, letting the aircraft sideslip just enough to bleed ground speed without exposing the belly to fragmentation. King finally spoke, his voice low in the intercom, not barking orders, but asking questions. A subtle shift that, even in the swirl of alarms, felt seismic. You planned this route. How many drones will commit to you before they retarget the fuel bladders? She answered without turning her head, her tone almost gentle. 3 have peeled already. 2 more will jump once the IR signature peaks at the flare cluster ahead. After that, we have 40 seconds before their logic tree cycles, and they look for bigger kills. He absorbed it like coordinates etched on bone, and she could almost hear gears turning as the colonel recalibrated everything he believed about her, about the label burned into her personnel file, emotionally unstable under cockpit stress, now revealed as a bureaucratic scar left by an accident no one had investigated deep enough to know the context. The breaking point wasn't the drones or the storm or even the impossible maneuver she was about to attempt. The breaking point was The moment Colonel Kane realized that everything he'd been told about Lieutenant Naomi Rhodes was a lie. Ahead, the maintenance spur bent 90 degrees around a derelict revetment piled with spare arrestor cables, forming the tightest turn on the entire airfield. Hairpin simulation instructors had removed from virtual maps because no fighter could negotiate it under combat load. Naomi aimed straight at the bend, throttled down to idle, and whispered a countdown under her breath. 7 seconds of kinetic drift. 6 of brake feathering. 5 of side yaw while pumping differential thrust. 4 as spoilers cracked open. 3 when the nose wheel kissed the outer concrete lip and the fuselage threatened to fishtail into the sand, except she countered with a microburst of left. Pedal and full forward stick, forcing the rear gear to pivot in an arc impossible by the book, yet effortless in real geometry. And the jet slid through the turn with inches to spare. Sparks skittered off the intake guards where they scraped. A maintenance light pole, but the pole toppled outward, clearing the wing by a breath. Ironclad 1 emerged onto the broad apron behind Hangar Row Alpha. From the tower, a voice half shrieked, half prayed, "Whoever is flying Ironclad 1, stop that maneuver." Naomi killed the radio volume and let the rest of the base scream into static. She had exactly one objective left. 2 strike fighters sat trapped on the main runway, noses pointed west, one with its starboard engine burning, the other still cold and intact but pinned behind wreckage. If the intact bird could taxi free, its ES radar and anti-drone missiles could join the automated batteries and thin the swarm. But only if someone removed a flaming wreck between it and safety. Naomi scanned the synthetic aperture overlay. On the HUD, plotting wind vectors, fuel puddle radiation, and the arc of shrapnel still rising from secondary detonations. She could not extinguish the fire remotely. She could, however, clear a path by drawing the drones and missiles even closer to her own jet, using herself as bait long enough for crash trucks to yank the burning hulk aside. Kane caught her intention from the shifting map layers. "That turn you just made was suicidal," he muttered, but there was awe in the mutter, and she felt him lean forward as though to see through her helmet into the calculus looping behind her pupils. She replied, "I rehearsed it at 1.4 Gs with full fuel. And half weapons. Real life is lighter, and the wind gives me rotational drag. These wheels could do it all day." He grunted something that might have been a laugh strangled by adrenaline. A new tone chimed. 2 drones, not micro-kamikazes, but UCAV spearheads broke from the cloud deck, descending on fast ballistic arcs. Their composite wings glinted in flashes of lightning, each carrying dual warheads capable of splitting a hardened shelter like rotten fruit. Naomi throttled up and swung onto the old fuel truck bypass, a straight shot back toward the burning strike fighter. She punched chaff and flares into the gale, but she also toggled the digital flight computer into semi-manual override, disabling terrain-following inhibitors so she could drop the nose to within 5 feet of the tarmac. An insane choice, because a single asphalt ripple could shear the landing gear. Yet crucial, because at that height her afterburner wash would blanket the runway with thermal distortion, confusing the UCAV seekers. The jet roared in a low-level sprint, shock waves rattling windows across the administrative block. Naomi tasted copper as G-loading pulsed through her spine. Still, she kept her left hand feathering throttle, right hand poised on the stick, eyes never blinking while sparks from the blazing fire whipped against her canopy like fiery snow. She veered past the wreck at 90 knots, rolling slightly to slipstream the flames toward the UCAV's infrared sensors. And behind her, the colonel's monitor lit red. Missile lock. 2 bogeys committing. Naomi ignored the lock tone, counting beats until the chaff cloud behind them matured. Then she jerked the stick hard right, popped air brakes mid-bank, and pitched into a flat spin, an aerobatic trick reserved for airshow daredevils, not frontline strike pilots taxiing on the ground. Yet the spin caused both missiles to overshoot as slammed nose first into the already burning fighter, detonating its residual fuel in a thunderclap that blew twisted aluminum 30 meters skyward and cleared a perfect path for the intact jet, now free to roll. Kane swore, hands gripping the seat frame, but cheers rose on the emergency channel crews celebrating as crash trucks surged, as the intact fighter's pilot signaled taxi, and the automated defenses recalibrated with new firing lines unobstructed. By wreckage, Naomi let Ironclad 1 spin, bleed off momentum, tapped toe brakes, leveled out, and coasted beneath the swirling curtain of smoke that now served as camouflage. Wind shifted, rain resumed, and for a heartbeat, the world turned gray and silent except for the ticking of cooling metal. Beneath the canopy, Kane spoke quietly, not to the base, not to command, but to her. "Lieutenant, you just saved this entire squadron." But Naomi was already thinking 3 moves ahead, because somewhere beyond the storm, muzzle flashes waited to test her again. Base to Ironclad 1 came the tower at last, a voice raw with disbelief. "The swarm is breaking. Off. Automated batteries confirmed 0 airborne contacts inside 5 miles. All surviving drones are retreating." Naomi eased the throttle to taxi power and turned toward the main apron, ready to guide the intact strike fighter into shelter. Kane popped his visor and stared at her profile, rain-slicked canopy light flickering against his face. In a tone devoid of irony, he said, "Lieutenant, the only reason I'm alive to regret every joke I made about you is that no one stopped you sooner." Naomi suppressed the swirl of emotions, vindication, exhaustion, sorrow for the label she still carried, and instead focused on the hundreds of troops now emerging from bunkers, eyes tracking her jet as though watching a myth roll past. She guided Ironclad 1 under the blast-proof arch of Shelter Alpha Zero and cut engines. Turbines wound down in a sigh that felt final. When the canopy cracked open, rain hissed on hot metal and steam rose in ghostly columns. She unclipped her harness, climbed out onto the ladder, and the moment her boots hit concrete, the entire maintenance crewmen who once laughed at the unstable tech stood at rigid attention, too shocked to speak. Kane descended behind her, boots landing with a clang. He stepped past her, turned to face the semicircle of personnel, and raised his voice over the fading alarms. "Remember this moment," he called, words carrying like hammer strikes. When the drones came, when the runway burned, and when every protocol failed, it was Lieutenant Naomi Rhodes who kept this squadron breathing. He paused, glanced at the tattered windsock still snapping madly overhead, then added for emphasis, "If any of you ever question her place on this flight line again, you'll answer to me." The silence broke with a single clap, then another, and suddenly the hangar echoed with applause battered, raw by wind and adrenaline, a ragged symphony of glove smacks and boot heels and half-choked cheers. Naomi's cheeks burned as she stood soaked in rain and fuel vapor, unsure whether to salute or run, until Kane leaned close and lowered his voice so only she could hear. "That coded word you whispered when you sat down. Where did you learn it?" She met his eyes, remnants of thunder reflected in her pupils, and answered softly, "From the pilot who trained me before the board wrote me off. Your old wingman, Cobber. He used it as a signal to trust instinct over doctrine." Kane swallowed. Coburn had died in an accident that still haunted him, and the board that grounded Naomi had cited the same crash. Now the ghost of that history hung between them, not accusation, but unfinished story. He straightened, gave the faintest nod, and for the first time since she arrived, spoke her call sign without contempt, Valkyrie. Then he said, "I suspect we're only at the beginning of what you can do." But back in the operations building, Secure phones were already ringing. Her unauthorized flight had been tracked, recorded, analyzed. Men in pressed uniforms 3 time zones away were asking hard questions about the lieutenant with no squadron patch who had just executed textbook perfect evasive maneuvers in an aircraft she wasn't authorized to touch. The same men who had buried her once were now faced with footage they couldn't explain away, because this time the whole world was watching, and the woman they'd tried to erase had just proved that some stories refused to stay buried. The rain turned steady, not wild, but weighty, as if the storm, now spent of its violence, lingered only to bear witness. On the apron, crews moved slower, not from fatigue, but from something else. Reverence, maybe, or a quiet recalibration of everything they thought they understood about who belonged where. Naomi stood in that hush, flight suit soaked and hair matted to her brow, as if the last 2 hours had scorched a layer of her away, revealing something sharper underneath. She hadn't expected the coded word to work. Not really. Not after all this time. Not after the tribunal had silenced everything attached to that name, that incident, that legacy. Instability, they had written. Emotionally unfit, they had ruled. But none of those men had flown with Coburn. None of them had heard what he whispered through gritted teeth the moment before impact. And none of them had seen what Naomi saw on that final descent, the maneuver that saved dozens but cost him his life. A maneuver the board said never happened. A log wiped. A cockpit voice recorder, lost in transit. And yet that one word, Vigil 7, was burned into her brain like a brand. Kane hadn't known she was there that day. That she had been his wingman's emergency co-pilot, inserted after a last-minute illness sidelined the usual crew. She wasn't even supposed to fly. She hadn't told anyone, not when she transferred bases, not when the investigations began. She followed orders. She shut her mouth. She signed the non-disclosure. And then she was gone from the airframe registry. Until now. Until she whispered that word and saw Kane's pupil's contract like he'd heard a ghost speak through her lips. Back in the operations building, everything had changed. The emergency protocol was lifted. The base resumed its mission tempo at least. Officially. But a dozen key figures were no longer focused on airlifts or sortie counts. They were watching the lieutenant with no squadron patch, no wings on her chest, and no recent flight hours, who had just executed a textbook-perfect live airfield evasive maneuver under hostile pressure with an aircraft she wasn't authorized to touch. Kane summoned her to the debriefing room not as a reprimand, but with quiet urgency. She followed him without resistance. He didn't speak in the corridor. His walk was slower now, more deliberate, and for the first time since she'd arrived on this base, his gait no longer outpaced hers. Inside the room, a wall-sized projection screen glowed with surveillance footage. Kane stood beside it, arms crossed. He gestured without looking. Sit. She did. The screen lit up with 4 angles. Tower view, HUD overlay, thermal drone intercept, and finally satellite footage from above the storm. All of them converged on one truth. Naomi had flown a mission that no one in command could explain. There had been no clearance, no authorizing signature, no chain of command. Just a seat she wasn't supposed to touch, and results no one could deny. He let the footage play for a full 3 minutes. Then, "Where did you learn to fly like that?" She didn't answer. "Rhodes," he said again, quieter. "Who trained you?" She looked at him then, not evasively, not defiantly, calm, composed, the way Coburn had taught her. "Sir," she said, "you already know." Kane didn't flinch, but his voice shifted. "That code you used, Vigil 7, only one person ever used that. With me in the air." It was his personal override phrase. Not logged, not doctrinal. I never even mentioned it in post-action reports. She nodded. Kane paced once, twice. Then he turned sharply. You were on that bird, weren't you? Coburn's. Last flight. Silence. You weren't listed in the crew manifest. They told us he flew solo. Said his WSO called out sick. They erased me, she said simply. Kane inhaled slowly, like something massive in his chest had just realigned. That's why the maneuver looked familiar. The lateral pivot. The roll left. Counter yaw. He tried to teach that to me. I said it was suicidal. He called it a bet against physics. But you, she looked him in the eye. I didn't just learn it, she said. I completed it. Kane dropped into the chair across from her, suddenly older, suddenly still. Why didn't you tell anyone? They made sure I wouldn't. I was 23. They told me my silence was protecting his legacy. Her fingers tensed on the table's edge. What I didn't realize was it protected their liability too. Kane cursed under his breath. You were written off. Grounded for instability. I was told I panicked in the cockpit. That I imagined the maneuver. That I'd fabricated it under stress. And you believe them? No, she said. But I obeyed. Kane stood, paced, then turned back toward the footage. You do realize that what you did today will blow every seal on that silence. I already had 2 calls, one from base command, one from Langley. Naomi's throat tightened. Are they grounding me again? Kane looked at her, a pause. No, he said. They're scared of what happens if you keep flying. But they're more scared of what happens if they try to stop you again. He moved to the corner cabinet, unlocked a narrow drawer, and pulled out a battered black flight binder. This was Coburn's, he said, laying it down in front of her. He left it in my quarters the night before his final flight. Said he was. Adding something classified, something not in the manuals. I never opened it. Thought it was grief talking. Naomi opened the first page. The title was handwritten in all caps. Vigil 7 Instinct Maneuvers Outside Flight Envelope. Her breath caught. Page after page filled with sketch diagrams, equations, alternate recovery paths, anti-drone countermeasures, terrain matching tricks. Half of it illegal. All of it brilliant. I thought I was the only one, she whispered. Kane nodded once. You weren't. He just never lived long enough to name you. Silence settled between them, not empty, but full. The kind of silence between pilots before a mission. The kind that means, now we understand each other. Then the alarm sounded again. Not a test. Not a drill. Real. Kane turned toward the monitor. Naomi was already on her feet. Multiple fast movers inbound, said the tower on speaker. Unknown radar profile, not drones. Jets. Kane's hand hovered over the comms. You're not cleared to fly combat, he said softly. Naomi moved past him. You think that matters now? She was already heading for the flight line, and this time, nobody moved to stop her. 6 years of silence were about to end in fire and thunder. The tarmac was wet, reflecting the baselights in broken shards of amber and white, as if the ground itself couldn't decide whether to mirror the chaos above or the order still struggling to hold. Naomi moved across the apron, like gravity didn't quite apply to her anymore, like the storm hadn't soaked her through, like the label on her file had burned off mid-maneuver, like the decades of rules stacked against her had finally cracked. Under the weight of one irrefutable fact, she was airborne before she even left the ground. Technicians stepped back instinctively as she approached the standby fighter, still fueled from the last alert. Ladder extended. Canopy cracked open. As if waiting, no one asked for clearance. No one dared. Kane was still in ops, fielding classified calls and facing the political tremors already rippling from her performance. But none of that mattered now. The second wave was coming. This time they weren't drones. They were manned, high speed. Low profile, radar-dampened aircraft flying nap of the Earth through the storm, using the clutter and thermal drag to punch holes in U.S. coverage while the base was still bleeding from the first strike. She didn't need a sitrep to understand what they were after. Strike suppression, retaliation, tactical embarrassment. The kind of move that doesn't just damage hardware, it demoralizes command. But Naomi also knew something they didn't. These incoming fighters didn't know she was up. They didn't know Ironclad 1 had survived. And they definitely didn't know she was about to be their final, unexpected problem. She pulled herself into the cockpit with the grace of someone not climbing but returning. The seat hugged her back, like it recognized her. Her fingers fell into switch positions without hesitation. Battery, fuel valve, generator, APU. The engine whine began its rising crescendo, as if impatient to launch before protocol could intervene. Her breath was steady, her mind clearer than it had ever been. No comms authorization, no flight plan, no support. Just instinct, and Coburn's binder still burned into her skull like a doctrine no one could erase. The canopy sealed with a hard hiss. Rain beaded and scattered. The HUD blinked to life altimeter, speed vector, radar signature, horizon. She punched in a blind transponder code Kane once used during unlocked escort missions and locked the nose wheel forward. As she pushed throttle, the fighter eased into motion, slow at first, the engine growling into thrust like an animal testing the reins. Tower began shouting calls she ignored. The runway lights pulsed. The blast doors opened halfway. She didn't wait for clearance. The engine surged. Afterburners kicked. And the jet launched forward in a streak of light and storm. Her body slammed into the seat as the airspeed tore upward through 90, 130, 180 knots. Wind crosscut. Gusts veered and fought. But she rotated with surgical smoothness nose up, and then she was airborne, gear folding away into the chassis like a decision finally made. The radar bloomed with contacts, 4 bogies, then 5. Flying low, tight, fast. Her comms squawked orders flooding in from command to return to base, to divert, to cease action until further notice. She toggled the comm to a ghost channel and let them talk to static. She wasn't here to obey. She was here to intercept. Altitude climbed. 1,000 feet, then 1,200. She adjusted pitch and carved left, climbing into a staggered spiral, giving herself distance above the incoming wave, stacking altitude so she could drop into their path unseen. Kane's voice finally punched through, overridden manually on the emergency override line. And his words weren't an order. They were quiet. Rhodes, if you're going to do this, do it clean. Make them see it. She didn't answer. She just banked harder, climbing above the last cloud layer and killing her lights. Below her, the enemy flight crept in, not expecting resistance. Their formation smooth and deliberate, built for intimidation. But they didn't see her in the upper shadow. Her radar signature was masked by the very storm they rode. They thought they were gods descending. Naomi knew what they really were, exposed. She dropped, flaps adjusted, vector calculated, wind drift compensated. She adjusted her fire control system to manual mode, no computer filtering, just pilot. And judgment. She dove. The cockpit filled with a deep hum of commitment. Airspeed rising like a scream she refused to voice. 480 knots. 530. Her vision tunneled slightly as G-forces clamped down, but she breathed steady. The HUD locked onto the tail end of the lit aircraft. She waited for the targeting diamond to close, waited, and fired. 1 missile. 1 detonation. The rear enemy jet disappeared in a burst of vapor and fire, debris scattering across the dark sky like embers from a divine forge. The rest scattered instantly, their formation breaking into chaos. She banked again, looping under, pulling G's. The frame barely tolerated and rolled behind the next. She didn't chase, she heard it. She pushed them west, away from the base, forcing them into her own staging zone where storm interference weakened their radar and the ground couldn't help. Then, her second missile clipped the wing of another. The jet spun. No shoot. She didn't look back. She moved to the third. He tried to lock her, but she faked left, threw countermeasures right, and slipped under his aim like smoke. She saw his hesitation pilot error, born of surprise. He wasn't expecting someone like her. None of them were. Kane was watching it. All from the tactical control center, monitors tracking her trajectory in awe and horror. The room behind him was silent, everyone watching. She took down the third aircraft with guns, no missiles left, a precise burst across the tail rudder that caused instant destabilization. A kill not by automation, but pure judgment. Old school, unforgiving. The fourth pilot ran. She didn't follow. She circled once above the wreckage, smoke curling into the clouds, then turned back toward base. Her fuel was low. Her heart was high. She didn't say a word on approach. She didn't need a tower guide. She landed with perfect glide slope, wind catching her just as it had in her simulations all those years ago. The ones they said she couldn't handle. Wheels kissed the tarmac. Brakes hissed. The fighter coasted to a slow halt just before the line of floodlights. Kane was already there. And this time, he saluted her. No words, just that. Behind him, every officer who'd ever doubted her stood in silence. The same men who'd laughed when she sat in Kane's seat. The same men who'd watched her erase an airstrike with nothing but grit and a ghost code. She opened the canopy, climbed down, boots firm on the ground that no longer questioned her. And then, without prompting, without ceremony, the first crew chief stepped forward and whispered, "Ma'am." Then another. Then the whole line. She never asked for rank. She never demanded respect. But she earned it with the one thing no tribunal could erase: flight. The storm had passed, not all at once, not cleanly. The clouds dragged themselves across the horizon like wounded beasts reluctant to surrender their hold on the sky. But the light that broke through was no longer filtered by rain or violence. It was sharp now, cold and honest, revealing the base as it was in the aftermath, scorched in patches, battered around the edges, but standing. The air smelled of ozone and jet fuel and wet concrete. Naomi stood alone beside the aircraft that had brought her full circle, her helmet in one hand, her gaze not on the people gathering behind her, but on the sky, that once denied her everything and now seemed finally to offer something back. Not forgiveness, not even vindication, just silence. And sometimes that was enough. Behind her, the colonel approached without hurry, not like before, not with the cadence of command. His walk now was that of a man crossing a bridge he never realized he'd burned. He stopped beside her, not quite shoulder to shoulder. No salute, no instruction, just presence. "Langley called again," he said quietly. "She didn't move, I figured. They're not sure what to do with you. That makes two of us." He nodded. "They know grounding you won't hold. Not anymore. The footage is out. The logs are archived. What you did is already being discussed at Joint Command level." She didn't flinch. "They'll want me somewhere they can monitor. They'll want to assign you to a role they can control." Same thing. Kane let out a breath, but I said no. That made her glance sideways. "You said no?" "I said if they want her, they'll have to promote her, not contain her." She turned to face him fully for the first time. "You did that?" He gave the faintest shrug. "You flew the seat. You saved the base. And you didn't just execute the maneuver Coburn theorized. You made it operational. You wrote doctrine with steel and speed and blood. There's no file in the world that can bury that now." Her throat tightened, but she kept it hidden. I don't want a ceremony. Kane's eyes narrowed, almost smiling. No one's offering one. That's not how this ends. She nodded, grateful. Then, what happens now? He gestured toward the far side of the tarmac, where a new squadron had begun to arrive, new aircraft, new commanders, teams deploying in from elsewhere to bolster the strike group in the wake of the attack. The rhythm of the military machine, restarting itself, now moving with new awareness of who stood inside it. You'll be assigned tactical systems integration, he said. At least, that's the plan. But you and I both know that won't last. She gave a half smile. They're going to try and box me again? No, he said, finally turning toward her. They're going to try and recruit you. And if they don't listen this time, if they try to reduce what you did to a footnote, you walk. And you let everyone who watched you land that bird talk instead. Naomi stared back toward the horizon. She thought of Coburn then, not as the legend, not even as the mentor, but as the man who once told her that flight wasn't about escape. It was about direction. That control was never about dominating the machine. It was about knowing where it wanted to go and then going there with it. She'd spent years grounded, silent, erased. But the machine had always wanted to fly. And now, it had. Kane said nothing more. He stepped back, gave her one last glance, and left. And for the first time, the space around her didn't feel isolating. It felt earned. She stood there a while longer. Pilots crossed the runway behind her, eyes lingering as they passed. Not with amusement now, not with skepticism, but with something else. Something slower, deeper. Respect. Some of them nodded. None of them spoke. Because sometimes the story doesn't need retelling. It just needs remembering. That night, Naomi walked the flight line alone. She still wore the same flight suit, still bore the same grease along her sleeves, but her walk had changed. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't measured. It was quiet, yes, but confident. The kind of walk that only comes when you've done something irreversible and you've decided not to run from it. The stars had come out, jagged between clouds still retreating. The airfield was mostly dark, except for the blue taxiway lights glowing faintly beneath her boots. She stopped beside the same aircraft she'd commandeered, its nose now patched. Fuel lines reconnected, systems being quietly inspected under soft lights by engineers who no longer joked when her name was mentioned. A technician nearby straightened when he saw her. You need access, ma'am? She blinked. Ma'am. Not lieutenant. Just... She let her hand rest against the fuselage. Just saying good night. He smiled and moved on. And for a moment, it was just her and the jet. She closed her eyes and heard the engines again, not in her memory, but in her body. In her spine. In her breath. The G-forces still folded into her bones, like a secret she wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not ever. She took a slow breath, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was trespassing. This place, this sky, this machinette, was hers. And when the next storm came, she wouldn't be waiting in the shadows. She'd be in the seat before they even sounded the alarm, because now they knew. And more importantly, she knew. Some stories don't need medals. Just a moment when the world finally sees what it almost erased. The legend of Valkyrie had begun. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.